Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are digging into the theological arguments for what's known as the pre-tribulation rapture. We're going to break down how the case is built step by step based on our source material.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at where the word rapture even comes from. Then, we'll explore this idea of a pattern of removal in the scriptures. After that, we'll get into a core promise about not being appointed to wrath. We'll even dive into a pretty interesting distinction between linen gowns and white robes. Then, a really cool analogy involving an ancient wedding, and finally, we'll put all the pieces together to see the final case.
So, this is usually where the conversation starts, right? It feels like a simple yes or no question. But, according to our source material, asking this might actually be missing the bigger picture. It might just be the wrong question to begin with.
See, the argument isn't really about whether a specific English word shows up in your modern English Bible. The real focus, the real question, is about a concept that's described in the original Greek manuscripts. And that concept is wrapped up in this one word, harpazo.
Okay, so let's follow the trail. How in the world did this one Greek word become the bedrock for such a major and, let's be honest, controversial idea about the end times?
Everything really hinges on this word, harpazo. And just look at that definition. This isn't talking about a gentle, slow floating up. It means to seize, to carry off by force, to snatch away. It's a sudden, powerful, and decisive action.
And here's how we get from there to here. It started with the Greek harpazo. When the Bible was translated into Latin, that word became rapiemur, which essentially means we shall be caught up. And from that Latin root, rapiemur, we get the English word rapture. So yeah, the word itself isn't in the English Bible because it's the translation of the original Greek idea.
So now that we understand the word, the source argues that this snatching away isn't some isolated one-off event. Instead, it's presented as a recurring theme, a pattern you can actually trace throughout the entire biblical story.
This is it. This is the key verse, the smoking gun. It's where that word harpazo is used to explicitly describe believers being suddenly caught up into the clouds. This verse is the anchor for the whole theory.
Now pair that snatching away with this passage which describes the speed of the event. We're not talking about a slow process. It's instantaneous, in the twinkling of an eye. So when you put these two verses together, you get a picture of a sudden, incredibly fast removal.
The argument then widens the lens and looks for historical examples. It points to Old Testament figures like Enoch and Elijah, who were literally just taken by God without ever dying. And it also highlights people like Noah, who was safely tucked away in the ark before the flood hit, and Lot, who was rushed out of Sodom before the fire fell. It's all meant to establish this pattern. God removes the righteous before judgment comes.
Okay, that pattern of removal brings us to the most crucial part of the argument, the timing. Why before the tribulation? Well, it all hangs on a very specific promise of deliverance.
According to the source, this verse right here is the foundation of the pre-tribulation view. The argument is simple. It's a direct promise that believers are specifically exempt from a future period of God's wrath.
But of course, for that promise to mean anything for the timing of the rapture, you have to establish one thing. Is the tribulation actually the wrath of God? The source argues that Scripture is incredibly clear on this point.
And here's the evidence laid out. The book of Revelation isn't subtle about it. It repeatedly and directly calls the tribulation the great day of his wrath, says the wrath of God is complete in the plagues, and commands angels to pour out the bowls of the wrath of God. So the logic is pretty straightforward. If believers are not appointed to wrath, and the tribulation is the wrath, then believers have to be gone before it starts.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. We're about to do a little bit of textual detective work. The source builds its case by focusing on a subtle but, it argues, very important detail, the different outfits worn by two groups of saints seen in heaven. Okay, check this out. In Revelation 19, you have the church, called the bride of Christ, returning with Jesus from heaven. They're wearing fine linen. They were already up there for something called the marriage supper of the Lamb. But if you look back in Revelation 7, you see a different group. These folks are called the tribulation saints, and they're identified as those who come out of the Great Tribulation and wear robes they had to wash white. The argument is these have to be two different groups. The first group was already in heaven before the second group even went through the tribulation on earth.
So to make this whole timeline easier to grasp, the source uses a really powerful analogy, one that would have been instantly recognizable to the people of that time. the customs of an ancient Jewish wedding.
Just look at how these parallels line up. The groom pays a price for his bride, just as Christ did. He leaves to prepare a place in his Father's house, just as Christ promised. And this is a huge one. Only the Father knows when it's time for the Son to go get his bride. When he finally returns, it's with a shout to, you guessed it, snatch away his bride. But here's the kicker. The couple would then go into a bridal chamber for 7 days. The argument is that this 7-day period is a direct parallel to the 7-year tribulation on earth, while the church is away with Christ in heaven.
Now, a common argument you'll hear is that this whole theory was just invented in the 1800s by a guy named John Nelson Darby. But the source makes a point to push back on that, pointing to much earlier writings, like this from St. Ephrem back in the 4th century. He wrote about saints being taken to the Lord prior to the tribulation, which suggests the core idea has been around for a lot longer than people think.
So after all that, the language, the patterns, the prophecies, the cultural analogies, how does it all weave together? Let's just quickly summarize the interlocking pieces that make up this argument.
According to the source, it's a cumulative case. You start with the forceful meaning of harpazo. You add the biblical pattern of removing people before judgment. You stand on the rock-solid promise of deliverance from wrath. You have clear evidence defining the tribulation as that wrath. You find clues in the 2 distinct groups of saints in Revelation, and the whole thing fits neatly inside the framework of an ancient Jewish wedding.
And that really leaves us with one final big-picture thought. This entire argument depends on reading these ancient texts not just for their translated English words, but through the lens of their original language, their historical patterns, and their cultural context. It really makes you wonder, how much does understanding all that ancient stuff change how we read a 2,000-year-old book today?